let's get into the very first technique that you're going to learn as a fly tyer, attaching your thread to the hook. Once you have a vise and some hooks, the first step is to attach your thread. The three things you have to remember when attaching your thread are the tag, the hook eye, and actually securing the thread. Let's start with the hook eye. Start your thread 1 to 2 hook eye lengths back from the start of the hook. This way, it leaves clearance for when you come back to the front of the fly. Now, on some flies, you do want to start in the middle or towards the back, but generally speaking, you start at the front of the fly. So it's a good habit to get into to start 1 to 2 hook eye lengths back. Now let's go to the tag. When you attach your thread, you will have a tag to remove. It's a good habit to get into to try to make this tag pretty small. On any given fly, you only use about 1 foot to 1.5 feet of thread. So let's say your tag is about 3 to 4 inches. You don't want 1/4 of all the thread you use on the fly to be in your tag. Now yes, you do own a lot of thread on one spool, but it's just a good habit to get into. The smaller the tag, the better. Now let's get into securing the thread. When you make the first couple of wraps, you want to secure the thread onto the hook, not towards the eye. So when you make those first couple wraps, you want your thread to overlap on top of the previous wraps, instead of going forward towards the hook eye with your thread wraps. So just remember when attaching thread to remember to start 1 to 2 hook eye lengths back, keep your tag small, and to secure onto your thread towards the back of the hook. And that is attaching thread. Next, I want to talk about flat versus twisted thread. When you're securing your thread onto the hook, you'll notice that with each wrap you create a little ridge with your thread. Sometimes you want those ridges. Sometimes you want a flatter profile on the fly. A good thing to keep in mind, like I said, is that flies are small products, so you would want small proportion changes. This is especially true for thread. Because there's different sizes of thread, you want to try to use the appropriate size of thread on the right hook. Sometimes thread becomes flat or twisted, and of course this is more visible on thicker threads. On flies, sometimes you want to fill an area, or you want to smooth out and taper a body. This is where twisted thread and flat thread come in. When you need to smooth an area out, this is when you flatten your thread. You flatten or twist your thread by spinning your bobbin. I couldn't tell you which direction, it's usually counterclockwise looking down on it. It's also a matter of testing which direction you put your spool on. And like I said, it's easier to tell on larger threads. Sometimes when you're using 8/0, you can't even tell the difference because it's so thin. But for larger threads, it does show, especially for 6/0. So just keep in mind when you want to flatten an area out or taper it, flatten your thread out. When you want to fill an area or fill a gap, twist up your thread. Now I want to talk about even-spaced wraps and the benefit to the rotary function on your vise. With thread, a lot of the time you wrap it in closed spirals. But how do you go about wrapping evenly? Well, before wrapping, you should prepare the area you're about to wrap over. First thing to keep in mind is whatever you're wrapping, is it thick or is it thin? And should you tie it in on the top or one of the sides of the hook? My rule of thumb is that if the material is thick, you should keep it on top. It keeps the fly symmetrical. But if it's a thin material, like tinsel, then you can get away with tying it in on the side. Second thing to keep in mind is preparing the area you're going to wrap over. This is where that flat and twisted thread comes in. You want the area to be free of ridges or bumps. Make sure it's smooth. Let's say you're tying a zebra midge. You want to make sure the thread you're wrapping over is smooth or at least gently tapered. Now it's time to wrap. You can either wrap by hand or with hackle pliers. You could also use the rotary function on your vise at this point as well. With spinning the vise with one hand and holding the material in the other, it becomes much more easy to make evenly spaced wraps. Just make sure, if you have a Renzetti Traveler, to tighten back up your vise after you do this, because you can wrap up the material perfectly and then you want to tie it off and you jostle the vise and then it gets all screwed up. So make sure you retighten after you get it nicely wrapped. And also just keep in mind to wrap evenly requires patience and practice. But if you follow these steps, it should become a lot easier. I'm saving you stress here. Now let's talk about adding dubbing. Another technique that comes with patience and practice is adding dubbing. You will probably hear this a lot, but less is more. So how do you go about adding dubbing? Well, for starters, take about 6 inches out from your bobbin, pull back on your bobbin, make sure there's like 6 inches of thread, and then to begin to pinch out a clump of dubbing from your pack. Take a pinch, from the pinch, from the pinch, from the pinch. Are you following? As best you can, align the grain of the dubbing with your thread. On thin, long fibered dubbing, this is very easy to tell. That's why I used it for this instruction. After you tried your best to align the grain of the dubbing with the thread, begin to twist counterclockwise or clockwise with your index and your thumb finger till it's tightly wound around the thread. Generally speaking, you also want a short dubbing noodle. Sometimes only an inch or 2 will do. Now here's a few techniques for dubbing. For starters, you can lick your fingers a little bit if you're adding some dubbing. This will slightly compress the dubbing a little bit more and make it a bit more even. Just don't double dip. You can also use sticky fly tires wax to further secure your dubbing. This will make your dubbing slightly darker though, and it will get on your fingers. It'll really compress the dubbing. Finally, you can also twist your bobbin, which in turn twists the dubbing even more. Just make sure you're doing this in one direction. And also I would recommend, if you're going to twist your bobbin to make the dubbing even, do this before you apply the wax, so the dubbing will still spin. I've seen better results that way. I would also like to mention mixing dubbing. Mixing dubbing is a real joy sometimes. Creating original buggy mixes is so much fun, and that's a big reason why I love fly tying so much, is the creativity. And also there are no rules in fly tying, but there are a few suggestions I have for making good dubbing mixes. Like I discussed in the previous section, there are different types of dubbing and different consistencies, so to speak, and also different colors. These all come into play when you're mixing dubbing. I would not recommend personally to mix dubbings of different lengths. Now, what do I mean by this? I don't mean something that has a very minor length difference. I mean mixing like streamer dubbing with the long fibers and something like otter dubbing. I know that wouldn't make sense, but what I'm trying to say, don't mix dubbing that will counteract their personal uses. So for that long streamer dubbing, that's good for movement and maybe color and flash, but that small bit of otter dubbing is basically just good for color and shape. See what I'm saying? Make sure they both do their job. If one dubbing is better at floating, try not to mix it with one that is sinking. Of course, unless you're making a nymph, in which case, go hog wild. Another thing is not to mix dubbings that will counteract each other's colors. I remember this one time I wanted to make this really buggy mix, and I mixed a whole bunch of colors together, and I was like, oh, they're all gonna do their own thing, and it's gonna be great. But it just turned into a muddy gray color, which sometimes you'd want, but in that case, why didn't I just use gray dubbing? It would have saved me a lot of time and effort, right? You see what I'm saying? And also, in my purest opinion, there are no rules in fly tying. But I don't generally mix synthetic dubbing with natural dubbing. Because in my opinion, synthetic flies really have a specific look to them. And natural flies really have a specific look to them. And I really look how they look individually. So I tend not to mix artificial and natural dubbing. But I'm not telling you not to do it. I'm just saying that's what I do. Because I like the kind of like different aesthetics and different types of dubbing and types of flies. But that's just my inner purist talking. So that is mixing dubbing. After you get a few packs of dubbing, I would highly recommend to get mixing and have some fun with it. So how do we go about mixing dubbing? Well, there's two main ways. One, on your tying desk. So if you have two dubbings that you'd like to mix, take them out, get a clump of each, and put them right on top of each other, and pinch them out. And then put those two clumps on top of each other, and then pinch them out, put those two clumps on top of each other, and keep doing this. As you do this, it layers those different colors, layers those different consistencies, layers those different lengths. So if you keep doing this, it will be a really nice mixed up dubbing ball. Is that as thorough as a coffee maker? No. But that is the next way you can mix dubbing, is using a coffee maker. If you have a coffee maker, don't steal it from your dad or anything like that. But if you have one to use, luckily I do, you can put those 2 clumps of dubbing in there and do short bursts, because you don't want to cut the dubbing, you want to mix it. So you just do short bursts and it should spin it around. You might need to help it along the way a little bit sometimes, but it should mix the dubbing very, very thoroughly. And at the end, you'll have a really nice product. So those are the 2 main ways to mix up dubbing. Now let's talk about adding weight to a fly. There are 3 ways you can add weight to a fly: beads, lead wire, and copper wire. Let's start with beads. Like I mentioned, there's 3 bead materials: plastic, glass, and metal. That is in order from lightest to heaviest. And there are variations within each of those materials as well. With plastic beads, they'll usually be in the jig shape, which is a slotted bead, or in the cyclops shape, which is just one hole is small on one side and one hole is big on the other. With glass, you usually just see them with a solid hole in between them, but if you see a fly tying glass bead, then they will be most likely in the cyclops style. Then there is tungsten, and you will pretty much see this in all styles: cyclops, jig, conehead, or teardrop style. Now, for the cyclops shaped beads, you usually see them on traditional hooks, nymph hooks, and streamer hooks. For the jig shape, the slotted one, you usually find them on jig hooks for nymphs. For the conehead, you see them a lot of the times on streamer hooks, and they are for streamers. And then for the teardrop shape, you'll find them usually used on nymph hooks for nymphs. Now let's talk about lead wire. With lead wire, you measure it in the 0.01, 0.02 weight category, and also you measure it by wraps. If you are only using lead wire to weight your fly, you want to orient the lead and center it. You don't want it off to one side or the other. But if you're using a bead, then orient your lead into the bead. And at that point, if you're using a bead and lead to weight your fly, then copper wire won't really affect the weight of your fly. Now let's talk about copper wire weighting your fly. Usually this counts towards weight on small flies, where there's barely any lead or none at all. Copper wire is usually wrapped as an abdomen to add weight and segmentation. Extra small wire and small wire won't add that much weight to your fly, but the sizes brassy and medium will add some weight. So that is adding weight to your fly. Now let's talk about adding hackle to a fly. Let's say you take a feather off a neck. Each feather has a natural curve to it, and when the feather is tied in on the fly, you can choose which direction those fibers want to lean. You could see this effect in place on flies like the elk hair caddis. The hackle fibers lean forward. On wet flies, the hackle direction is facing back. The bright side of the feather is called the shiny side. The shiny side is what you use to orient those hackle fibers. So if you tie in the hackle shiny side facing you, that means the hackle fibers will want to lean back. Now, if you tie it in shiny side facing away, that means the hackle fibers will want to jump forward. So what about dry flies that include 2 or 3 hackles, like an Adams? Ideally, the hackle fibers should cross each other when you tie them in. This will help the fly float because it'll have more points of contact on the water's surface. But if you are just starting, then only tie dry flies requiring 1 hackle, like an elk hair caddis or a very basic catskill dry fly. Now let's say you're tying a dry fly with only 1 hackle. Which direction should it go? Well, I prefer tying it shiny side facing me because the hackles will want to jump back, which makes an easier clearance at the front of the fly when I tie it off. But you could also tie it forward. it really doesn't matter when it comes down to one hackle. To cross the hackles, tie one in with the shiny side facing you and the other shiny side facing away. Then wrap them both clockwise or horizontally in the same direction. Then tie them both off. And also remember to space them out. With your first hackle, only make about 3 to 4 wraps, and with your second, do the same, leaving space for both. And that is how you would wrap 2 or 3 hackles, but if you are just beginning, then stick to 1 and then move on to 2. Now let's talk about proportion, a very big and important thing in fly tying. You might see other fly tiers using their hook to decipher proportions for the fly, and they do this for good reason. There are good general proportions to follow when you're tying a fly, and you usually just follow the proportion of the hook itself. Probably one of the most basic proportions you can follow is for proportions on a dry fly. There are a few key parts of a hook to use for consistent proportion. Now, it might seem complex, but trust me, it really is simple. First, there is the hook eye, and you already know this. It tells you how far back to start your thread on a hook. Next is the barb point. The barb point, this is where you stop your thread when you're wrapping back, and where you would first tie in a tail on a dry fly. But let's say you bought a barbless hook. Where should you end your thread? Well, it should be at the start of the bend of the hook. That is another place on a hook that people use to decipher their proportion. Now let's talk about the hook gap. The hook gap is the space between your hook point and the top of the shank. Do not include the bend. Generally speaking, on your dry flies, your hackle should extend 1.5 to about 2 times the size of your hook gap. And if you don't own a hackle gauge, this is also a good way to test the length of your hackle before you tie it in. Now let's talk about hook length. This is used to measure tails, cut wings, and other parts of a fly. The length of the hook, generally speaking, is from the start of the bend to the hook eye. Now, most of these are pretty standard proportions, except for emergers. Emergers break this rule. That's why they're one of my favorite flies to tie. The bodies go into the bend of the hook. Their tails are extra long or extra short sometimes, and the emerging shuck can vary as well. Sometimes it only is a bit of yarn tied going that way, sometimes it's a lot of CDC pointing this way, sometimes it really extends past the hook eye. There's a lot of variations on emergers. But generally speaking, if you stick to the proportion of the hook you're tying on, you should be fine. So that is proportion. Now let's talk about attaching fragile materials. Boy, do I have history with this. There's nothing worse than tying in a material and having it basically immediately snap, or snap along the way, which is especially aggravating. What I'm talking about is pheasant tail. The most common materials for me that want to snap randomly are extra small wire, peacock herl, ostrich herl, and like I said, pheasant tail. Thread pressure is very important here. You don't want to be tying these materials in very tightly because they're more prone to snap, especially at the point where you're tying it on deep into the hook, and then there's that point at which you're going to start wrapping it, right? That last thread wrap, or those last couple thread wraps, are very important. Do not apply too much pressure. Be very gentle with the material instead. And when you wrap up, also be very gentle. Don't be tugging on it. Don't be applying a lot of tension to it. Another reason to get articulated hackle pliers. Another tip with attaching fragile materials is sometimes you need to soak your quills. So if you're using a whole feather to just use the quill, you might as well make it worth your while and soak it. There's been times where I want to use a quill and I just use a dry quill and then it snaps on me, and I know it's going to snap even further in the water because it's so dang dry and old. So a tip for that is soaking your quills, and that's attaching fragile materials. On that same topic with these fragile materials, I want to talk about strengthening them. Hackle, peacock herl, ostrich herl, and other materials will all want to unravel. They'll want to unravel while you're tying, or if they're in a fish's mouth, and that doesn't make for a fun day of fishing. To make sure they don't unravel, you secure another material over them. This is usually wire, but it can also be your thread or another hackle. You'll see this on Elk-Hair Caddis, where you want to wrap up copper wire over the hackle. You'll also see this on woolly buggers. And like I said, the securing material can be whatever you want it to be, as long as it protects with that material underneath. So that is strengthening fragile materials. So now you have a deer pelt, and you want to make an Elk-Hair Caddis. To begin, trim off a pencil width clump from the pelt. As you do this, make sure to hold the tips of the clump in one hand while the other hand cuts it from the base. After you trim, cut out the underfur from the pelt with a comb or a dubbing brush, or pinch it out with your fingers. After this, grab the clump with your other hand, grabbing the cut tip ends. With the hair now in that hand, insert it tip down into your hair stacker. Begin to tap on your hair stacker on your thumb or your table, depends how much noise you're allowed to make. Keep tapping until you see the cut ends at different lengths. That's how you know your clump is stacked. At this point, you can pick up your stacker, tilt it horizontal, grab the other end with one hand, tilt it just a bit more, and gently remove the two halves. At this point, you should have hair sticking out that end. Pinch it and remove it. At this point, again, grab the clump with your other hand and grab the cut ends, gently. At this point, you can measure the length of the clump compared to your hook's proportion. After that, you're ready to tie it in. Place the clump on top of the hook and begin to make 2 gentle, light wraps around the clump. Then on your third wrap over, pull down tight, but don't snap your thread. At this point, you should see both ends flare out, and that's good. As you're making these wraps, make sure your left hand is holding the clump so it stays in place. It'll want to roll over to the other side, so make sure you're holding it to keep it up as you're tightening down on it. At this point, you should have some deer hair properly and securely attached to your hook. And after that point, either trim off the cut ends, or if you're making an Elk-Hair Caddis, just keep a little nub there. But that is how you attach hair. Now let's talk about spinning deer hair. Now let's say you want to make a Goddard Caddis. Same procedure, plus and minus a few steps though. Start by getting a large clump of deer hair off, maybe about 2 to 3 times the amount you want for a Elk-Hair Caddis. Then, without stacking, just comb out the underfur. Again, make 2 loose wraps and make the third wrap the tightest one, but don't snap your thread. The clump will want to spin on you, but that is okay. You should be holding the clump in your left hand and the other end should be flaring. After that third wrap, you can let go of the end. It might want to spin on you a little bit, but that is the point. Different shirt, different day. Alright, let's get to making wings. Now, making wings on dry flies is super fun. It adds a bit of style to an otherwise boring fly. And there's many ways to do this as well. You could use wood duck, you could use some sort of deer hair or animal hair, and you can use synthetic materials as well. The majority of these wings are made by cutting a material or taking a material and tying it in to where it passes the hook eye, and then pinching it, propping it back, and tying back onto it to prop it up. And then usually followed by X wraps to separate them out into 2 individual wings. And then there's also cut wings. Now, as far as I know, cut wings is a term used to describe when you use hen hackle to form the shape of a mayfly wing. When you tie them in, try to tie them in vertically, as opposed to tying them over the hook eye and propping them back, because sometimes you need to pull down on them to align them vertically, because sometimes they'll want to Mickey Mouse out on you, and that's not good. I've had that happen on some of my dry flies, and when you try to cast that, that's going to go whoo, and it's not going to be good. It's going to flop all over the place, fly everywhere, catch wind. It's not a good place. So if you're going to use cut wings or make cut wings, keep them just like that. You don't want them to Mickey Mouse. Spinner wings are also very similar, except for that you don't prop them up. You just tie them in with X wraps. That's your Rusty Spinners and any other spinner. And that is making wings on dry flies. It's very simple, very fun, and adds some style to an otherwise boring, not boring, but otherwise boring fly, you know?
Now let's talk about parachute posts. A parachute fly is basically just a fly where the hackle is horizontal instead of vertical. And they do this by tying in a post that they tie onto the fly and then on which they will tie their hackle and wrap it. In my humble opinion, the best material to make a parachute post with is some sort of yarn. The reason I say this is because in one string or one strand of yarn, you can unwind it into several thinner strands of yarn so you can accommodate different sizes of hooks. Usually, I'll unravel one that's in 6 sections and just use one of them. Once you tie in this piece of yarn, you can also further sturdy it by twisting it, right? Pinching it at the top, folding it in half, and tying off that other end. And because it's twisted up, it'll want to twist onto itself and it'll make a very sturdy post without compromising any space on the hook. Thick post, thin tie-in points. And it's just that simple, and that's tying a parachute post. Now let's move on to whip finishing, the actual technique of it. You might hear from other fly tyers, like I did earlier in this section, me too included, to use a whip finisher first. And while that's good, I have actually never had that much luck with a whip finisher, or a nail knot tool for that matter. They're a bit easier, but still, I struggle. I've tried multiple types. I've tried the Monterelli, I've tried other ones. They all haven't worked for me. And honestly, you don't need to learn either, because you can just do it by hand. The only case where I wouldn't whip finish by hand is on a very tight dry fly or something with spun deer hair on it. I wouldn't whip finish because honestly it's pretty hard. I still sometimes try though. On that case, use a nail knot tool. But other than that, whip finish by hand. So here is my tutorial on whip finishing by hand.
All right, so this is my tutorial on how to do a hand whip finish. The first thing you're gonna do is draw out 6 to 8 inches of thread and hold it with some tension. Next step is to get your pointer and your middle finger and place it on the thread, a couple inches out. Then, holding tension with your bobbin, you're going to wrap around those fingers. Then you're going to do a maneuver and rotate your fingers and make this thread go over your original thread. And you should make a cross knot. Then, by slightly pulling on your bobbin and pulling down with your middle finger and raising up with your whole hand, you're going to bring that knot that you made to the hook and secure it onto the hook. Then you're going to do that same process by rotating your pointer and your index back like that and make another one of those cross knots. And then you're going to do the same process and put that knot right next to the other one, back to front. Now your knot is secured on the hook, and this is your 3rd wrap, 4th wrap, 5th wrap, 6th wrap. Then at that point, holding tension with your middle finger and bobbin, you see how they can go back and forth? You're going to catch this loop with your index. Remove your middle finger, grab your closest scissors, and insert it into the loop and tilt it down so it doesn't slip out on you. Tilt it down. Hold them both with tension, and like I said, you can go back and forth with these knots. You're just going to pull with your bobbin and keep tension with your scissors angled down and pull the knot. And this is the tricky part, but you're going to release this holding tension on your bobbin. There you go. Tighten your whip finish. You tighten your whip finish up, trim the excess, and that is how you hand whip finish.
Now, you finished up tying some of your flies, and you need to secure and seal that finishing knot. This is where head cement comes in. For the past 3 years, I've only ever used head cement. And sorry, I can't be that guy that uses all these different products. I'm just not that guy. I've been satisfied with head cement, and I forever will be. A bottle of head cement will last you forever, along with a dubbing needle. I keep it simple. The only problem though, like I mentioned earlier, is that head cement takes a while to cure. So a technique is when you're finished your fly, just don't let it rest on anything. Don't let the head of the fly touch anything and let it dry. And that is the technique section.